Dear listeners, a new day and a new story to discuss. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that interests me. Listen and write down what you think about this situation. I'm interested in your opinions. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the city as I, Nathan, a man of 38 years, drove through the familiar streets. My mind was preoccupied with the mundane details of my sales job, oblivious to the storm that was about to break in my life. As I turned a corner, a sight caught my eye, a sight so jarring it felt like a punch to the gut. There, at a roadside cafe, was my wife Alara, her arm linked intimately with George, my stepfather. The image was like a freeze frame, seared into my mind. Alara, with her chestnut hair cascading over her shoulders, leaned in close to George, laughter touching her lips. George, a man in his early 50s, whom I had never accepted as a father figure, sat too close, too familiar. My heart raced, a cocktail of disbelief and dread churning in my stomach. I parked my car a short distance away, my hands trembling. This can't be right, I muttered to myself, hoping it was a misunderstanding. Stealthily, I approached the cafe, my steps heavy, each one echoing the pounding in my chest. As I neared, their conversation became audible, their laughter a discordant melody to my ears. Alara, you always know how to make me laugh, George said, his voice a little too warm for comfort. Alara's reply was light, flirtatious even. Oh, George, we need to keep spirits high, right? I felt a surge of anger. They were so engrossed in each other they didn't notice me. I wanted to confront them, to shout, to demand an explanation, but I was rooted to the spot, a silent spectator to their betrayal. After a few eternal minutes, I retreated to my car, my mind racing. The drive home was a blur, a tumult of emotions raging within me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, confused. Why Alara? Why George? The questions circled in my head like vultures over a carcass. Upon reaching home, I found Alara in the kitchen, humming a tune as she cooked. The normalcy of the scene was surreal. Alara, we need to talk, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. She turned, a smile on her face that faltered at the sight of my expression. Nathan, what's wrong? You look pale. I took a deep breath. I saw you today. With George. At the cafe. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of panic. Nathan, it's not what you think. George was just, he's lonely, and I. Lonely? I interrupted, the word bitter in my mouth. So, you comfort him by laughing and leaning into him like you're a couple? She reached out to me, but I stepped back. Nathan, please, let me explain. It was just lunch. He's been down since your mom passed. I thought. You thought what, Alara? That you'd play the comforting stepdaughter-in-law? My voice was a mix of sarcasm and pain. Her eyes welled up. It's not like that. We just ran into each other, and he suggested lunch. Nothing's going on, Nathan. I looked at her, the woman I had loved for 7 years, and felt a gulf between us. I don't know what to believe anymore, Alara. She took a step forward, desperation in her eyes. Believe me, Nathan, there's nothing between George and me. You have to trust me. I turned away, unable to bear the sight of her. I need time to think, I said, my voice barely a whisper, and walked away, leaving her standing in the kitchen, her plea hanging in the air, unanswered. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of doubt and betrayal creeping over me. My thoughts were a whirlwind, a mix of memories and newfound suspicions. Sleep was a distant dream, as I grappled with the reality that had so abruptly shattered my world. The dawn crept in silently, casting a new light but offering no solace for my restless heart. I, Nathan, found myself in the kitchen, nursing a strong cup of coffee, my mind a maze of memories and doubts. As the sun's rays filtered through the window, casting elongated shadows on the floor, I began to unravel the threads of the past. Our marriage, a tapestry of 7 years, had its share of vibrant hues and dark patches. Alara, with her vibrant personality and infectious laughter, had been my anchor in turbulent times. But as I sifted through the years, I realized that the seeds of discontent had been sown long ago. I recalled a conversation from a few years back, a typical evening at home. Alara was browsing through a magazine, and I was sharing anecdotes from my day. Alara, you won't believe what happened at work today. I began, but she cut me off. Nathan, do you ever spend time anywhere other than work or your mom's place? She asked, her tone tinged with irritation. I was taken aback. Well, I have responsibilities, Alara. Mom's alone since Dad passed away. She sighed, setting the magazine down. I know, but it feels like you're more her husband than mine sometimes." Her words stung, and I remember feeling defensive. "Alara, she's my mom. She needs me." Alara leaned back, frustration evident in her eyes. "I need you too, Nathan. But it's always about your mom." I remember trying to reason with her. "It's not like I'm neglecting you. I'm here now, aren't I? But when you're here, you're not really here. Your mind is always somewhere else," she countered. That conversation had ended in silence, an uncomfortable void that had started to widen with time. As I delved deeper into the past, I remembered my mother, a woman of strength and warmth. After my father's passing, she had been my world. Then George came into her life, a man who remained an enigma to me. I recalled the day my mother introduced George to me. We were in her living room, the air filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies. "Nathan, this is George. I've told you about him," my mother had said, her eyes shining. I had nodded, extending a hand to George. "Nice to meet you, George." His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a reserve that I couldn't penetrate. "Likewise, Nathan. Your mother speaks highly of you." The conversation that followed was cordial, but I felt an invisible wall between George and me. My mother's happiness was paramount, so I never voiced my reservations. After her passing, my world crumbled. She had been my confidant, my supporter. Her absence left a void that I struggled to fill, and perhaps, in my grief, I had leaned on Alara more than I realized. Sitting in the quiet of the morning, I pondered over Alara's words from last night. Could it be possible that her lunch with George was innocent? Was my grief clouding my judgment, making me see shadows where there were none? But then, the image of them at the cafe flashed in my mind. Their closeness, their laughter. It was a scene that didn't fit in the puzzle of our life together. With a heavy heart, I realized that to find the truth, I would have to confront not only Alara but also the shadows of the past. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and fears, but I knew I couldn't turn back. The unraveling of the past was just the beginning. The morning light had fully taken hold, casting a warm glow across the room, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill in my heart. Nathan, sat at the kitchen table, my coffee long gone cold, wrestling with the memories that fed the seeds of doubt in my mind. George, my stepfather, had been a part of our lives for a decade, but to me, he had always been more of a distant figure than a family member. My mother had met him during a period of loneliness, and their whirlwind romance had culminated in a quiet wedding. I remember the day she told me about him, her eyes filled with a happiness that she hadn't known since my father passed away. "Nathan, I've met someone," she had said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and nervousness. I remember feeling a jolt of surprise. "Someone? Mom, what do you mean?" She had taken my hands in hers, her eyes searching mine. "His name is George. He's wonderful, Nathan. I haven't felt this happy in years." I had tried to be happy for her, but a part of me felt uneasy. "Are you sure about him, Mom? You barely know him." She had smiled, a serene, content smile. "I know it seems fast, but when you reach my age, you don't want to waste time. George makes me feel alive again." I hadn't been able to argue with her happiness, so I had swallowed my doubts. Over the years, I watched them together, George always a step behind my vibrant mother. They seemed happy, but I couldn't bring myself to warm up to him. He was polite, always cordial, but there was a guardedness in his eyes that I couldn't penetrate. My interactions with George had been minimal, limited to obligatory family gatherings and brief visits. Even after my mother's passing, I had kept my distance. He had stayed in the house they shared, a constant reminder of the life my mother had left behind. The day I saw Alara and George together at the cafe, those seeds of doubt had sprouted into gnarling vines, choking my trust and clouding my judgment. The image of them, so close, so comfortable with each other, was in stark contrast to the relationship I knew they had, or thought they had. I replayed that scene in my mind over and over, each time feeling a fresh wave of betrayal. Why were they there? What was the nature of their relationship? The questions gnawed at me, demanding answers that I was afraid to uncover. I decided to confront Alara again, needing more than the fragmented explanation she had offered before. I found her in the living room, her eyes red from crying. "Alara, we need to talk more about this." "About you and George," I said, my voice firm but weary. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. "Nathan, I've already told you, there's nothing going on. But why were you with him? And in such an intimate setting?" I pressed, unable to hide the frustration in my voice. Alara sighed, a deep, heavy sigh. "Nathan, you've been distant, lost in your grief. George, he's been a friend, someone to talk to." "A friend?" The word tasted bitter. You've never mentioned him as a friend before." She stood up, facing me squarely. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand. You've always kept him at arm's length, even though he was your mother's husband." I shook my head, disbelief and anger mingling. "So you decided to comfort him? To be his confidant?" Alara's voice rose, a tinge of defensiveness creeping in. "What was I supposed to do, Nathan? You were always with your mother or buried in work. I was alone." Her words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I faltered. Had my grief and preoccupations blinded me to her needs? But no, this didn't justify her actions, her betrayal. "Alara, being lonely doesn't give you the right to find solace in my stepfather's arms," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. She reached out to me, but I stepped back. "Nathan, please, try to understand. I was just trying to help." I cut her off, the pain in my heart turning into resolve. "I can't. Not now. Whatever this is, it's too much." With those words, I left the room, leaving Alara standing there, her plea hanging in the air. The seeds of doubt had taken root, and now they were growing uncontrollably, clouding every memory, every moment of our life together. I knew then that the path ahead was fraught with pain and revelations that I might not be ready to face. But I had no choice. The truth, however painful, had to be uncovered. The chill of late November was setting in, the leaves had turned auburn, and the world outside seemed to be preparing for the winter slumber. Inside our home, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The preparations for Thanksgiving were underway, but this year, there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Alara had been surprisingly insistent on inviting George for dinner. "He's all alone, Nathan," she had said one evening as we sat planning the guest list. "It's the right thing to do." I remember looking at her, perplexed and a little suspicious. "But we've never invited George over before." "Why now?" She avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the list in front of her. "Things change, Nathan. He was your mother's husband, after all." I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to her insistence than met the eye. But I agreed, albeit reluctantly, curious to see how the evening would unfold. As Thanksgiving Day dawned, our home was a flurry of activity. Alara was in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, as she hummed a tune while preparing the turkey. I tried to engage in the festivities, but my mind was elsewhere, clouded with doubts and unanswered questions. The doorbell rang in the late afternoon, announcing George's arrival. I opened the door to find him standing there, a bottle of wine in hand, a polite smile on his face. "Happy Thanksgiving, Nathan," he greeted, stepping inside. I returned the greeting, taking the wine from him. "Thanks for coming, George." The dinner table was a picture of abundance, with the turkey at the center, surrounded by all the traditional trimmings. But as we sat down to eat, the air was thick with unspoken words. Alara was the perfect hostess, filling plates and making light conversation. But I noticed the way she occasionally glanced at George, a look that seemed out of place, too knowing, too intimate. "So, George, how have you been holding up?" I asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the table. He looked up, his fork paused midway to his mouth. "Oh, it's been quiet. But I manage." Alara chimed in, her voice a little too cheerful. "We all need company, don't we, George? It's tough being alone during the holidays." I could feel my jaw clenching at her words, the implications not lost on me. George, however, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, merely nodding in agreement. The conversation drifted to mundane topics, but the tension remained, an invisible guest at our table. I found myself observing George and Alara, looking for any sign, any hint that would confirm my suspicions. As the evening wore on, I noticed them sharing a few private smiles, their eyes meeting across the table in a way that made my stomach churn. It was subtle, but to me, it was as glaring as a neon sign. The final straw came when I caught a fleeting touch, Alara's hand brushing against George's under the table. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. My heart raced, a cocktail of anger and betrayal bubbling within me. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me, I need some air," I mumbled, barely able to contain the turmoil inside me. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging in my heart. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a picture that I was reluctant to see. As I stood there, alone in the cold, I realized that the Thanksgiving revelation was just the beginning. The seeds of doubt had sprouted into a tangled web of deception, and I was caught in the middle, struggling to make sense of it all. The path ahead was murky, filled with uncertainties and potential heartaches, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The days following Thanksgiving were shrouded in a thick fog of uncertainty and suspicion. The festive cheer had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy air of tension between Alara and me. I was a man on the edge, caught in the turmoil of betrayal and the desperate need for truth. I knew I couldn't let this gnawing suspicion continue to eat away at me. I needed answers, and for that, I had to take matters into my own hands. The idea of spying on my own wife felt distasteful, almost treacherous, yet the need to know the truth outweighed my reservations. I formulated a plan, one that required meticulous execution and discretion. The first step was to create a believable alibi. I told Alara I had an out-of-town business trip, a 2-day conference that couldn't be avoided. Another trip? Nathan? Alara's voice was laced with frustration as I packed my suitcase. I avoided her gaze, focusing on my task. It's important, Alara. I can't skip this one. She sighed, resigning to the situation. Fine, just be safe. With my alibi set, I left home early, driving not towards the airport but towards the office of an old friend, Keith, who ran a private investigation firm. I needed his expertise and resources. Keith, I need your help, I said as I entered his office, the weight of my situation evident in my voice. He looked up, concern etched on his face. What's going on, Nathan? You look troubled. I poured out my suspicions, the encounters, the Thanksgiving dinner, everything. Keith listened, his expression growing graver with each word. This is delicate, Nathan. Are you sure you want to go down this path? He asked, his tone serious. I nodded, resolute. I need to know, Keith. I can't live with this doubt. Keith agreed to help, and we hatched a plan. We would place a GPS tracker in Alara's car to monitor her movements. The idea was to see if she would meet George while I was supposedly out of town. The next part of the plan was the hardest. I had to act normal, bid Alara goodbye as if everything was as usual. I kissed her cheek, the touch feeling foreign, and left with my heart pounding against my chest. Once the tracker was in place, the waiting game began. I stayed at Keith's office, my eyes glued to the computer screen, watching the blip that represented Alara's car. Hours passed, and the tension mounted. Then, in the late afternoon, the blip started moving, heading towards a familiar destination, George's house. My heart sank. I felt a mix of vindication and despair. Keith put a hand on my shoulder, a silent show of support. I'll go check it out, Keith offered. You stay here. Keith drove to George's house, equipped with a hidden camera. I waited, every minute stretching into an eternity, my mind racing with possibilities. Keith returned with the footage, his expression grim. Nathan, you need to see this. The video was shaky, but clear enough. It showed Alara and George in an intimate embrace, their actions leaving no room for doubt. My world crumbled around me, the truth hitting me like a physical blow. I sat there, numb, the images playing over and over in my mind. The woman I loved in the arms of a man I never trusted. The betrayal cut deep, tearing apart the fabric of our 7-year marriage. Thanks, Keith, I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. I knew what I had to do next, but the thought of confronting Alara, of facing the reality of our broken marriage, filled me with dread. The path to uncovering the truth had led me here, to a crossroads where every direction led to pain and disillusionment. But I couldn't turn back now. The truth was out, and it demanded to be faced, no matter how devastating it might be. The world outside was cloaked in the darkness of early evening, but inside my heart, it felt like a never-ending night. Armed with the bitter truth of Alara's betrayal, I knew the time had come for confrontation and, inevitably, closure. I drove home, the journey feeling longer than it ever had. My mind was a tempest of emotion, anger, sadness, disbelief. Each mile brought me closer to a confrontation I both longed for and dreaded. As I turned into our driveway, the sight of our house, once a symbol of marital bliss, now felt like a hollow shell. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself for the inevitable storm that was about to break. I found Alara in the living room, her back to me, gazing out the window. The calm before the storm. Alara, I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. We need to talk. She turned, her expression shifting from surprise to concern upon seeing my face. Nathan, what's wrong? You're back early. The normalcy of her tone stung. I took out my phone, showing her the video Keith had captured. This is what's wrong. Her eyes widened as she watched the video, the color draining from her face. Nathan, I can explain, she stammered. Explain? I echoed, the words sounding hollow. How do you explain this, Alara? She reached out to me, but I recoiled. It's not what it looks like. George and I, we just got Close. Close? My voice rose, a mix of anger and pain. You call that close? That's a betrayal, Alara. Tears brimmed in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. George was there for me when you weren't. Her words were like a knife twisting in my heart. So, this is my fault? For grieving my mother? No, not like that, she hurried to say. But you were so distant, Nathan. I felt alone. Alone? I scoffed. So, you turned to my stepfather? How could you, Alara? She was sobbing now, her composure shattered. I'm sorry, Nathan. I never wanted it to come to this. I shook my head, disbelief and sorrow mingling. Sorry doesn't change what you did. It doesn't erase the betrayal. We stood there, two people, once bound by love, now separated by a chasm of betrayal. The air was thick with unsaid words and unshed tears. I can't stay here, I finally said, my voice breaking. I can't be with you, not after this. Alara reached out again, desperation in her eyes. Please, Nathan, don't leave. We can fix this. I stepped back, the finality of my decision settling in. There's nothing left to fix, Alara. You broke us. Turning away from her, I headed to our bedroom to pack a few essentials. Each item I picked up was a reminder of a life that was no more, a dream shattered by betrayal. As I zipped up my bag, Alara appeared in the doorway, her face a picture of despair. Nathan, please. Let's talk about this. I looked at her, the woman I had shared my life with, and felt a profound sense of loss. There's nothing left to say, Alara. I'll have my lawyer contact you. With those final words, I left, walking out of the house and out of the life we had built together. The night air was cold, but it was nothing compared to the chill in my heart. The drive to Keith's place, where I had decided to stay temporarily, was a blur. My mind replayed the events of the past weeks, each memory a shard of glass cutting into me. I arrived at Keith's, my emotions raw and exposed. He opened the door, his expression somber. I'm sorry, Nathan, he said simply, ushering me in. I nodded, unable to find the words to express the turmoil inside me. The fallout of my marriage was more than just the end of a relationship. It was the shattering of trust, the crumbling of a shared future. That night, as I lay in the guest room at Keith's place, the reality of my situation sank in. The path to uncovering the truth had led me here, to a place of pain and uncertainty. But in that pain, there was also a sense of liberation from the lies, the doubts, and the deceit. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with the daunting task of rebuilding my life. But as I closed my eyes, a part of me knew that this was the first step towards healing, towards a future where I could find peace and, perhaps, trust again.